So, the other day I did a video where I bought over 400 lands, and today I want to take a deeper dive into why I did that. Alrighty guys, today I want to talk about dual lands, and I want to propose an argument. Dual lands aren't actually that good. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's no way that after hearing that, I'm going to want to subscribe to this guy's channel and also hit the bell notification icon and also subscribe to his Patreon. But you should do those things for completely unrelated reasons. We're going to talk about the reasons why I want to make the statement that I did, though. And, well, it's kind of really simple. You're gonna say something along the lines of, the original dual lands are classic, they're searchable, they're legendary lands in the history of Magic, and they're used in formats like Legacy for a reason, Suris. And I hear you, but I do want to throw a couple things out there for you, just real quick. One, I'm talking about in Commander. And in Commander, we can afford a land coming into play tapped once or twice. But I want to back up that statement with a follow-up. Dual lands are there to guarantee that you always have a perfect mana curve. You always have the pipping you need for everything all the time. And Commander decks are not built with perfect curves in mind. Even some of the most highly optimized decks outside of CDH do not have perfect mana curves. By comparison, if I am playing in, say, Modern, another format that I play, then it is very likely that if I am mulliganing for my opening hand, I am looking for the ability to play, say, Hardened Scales as my first spell. If I don't have Hardened Scales in my opening hand, I may be looking for an Ozolith as my first spell. And if I don't have either of these, I'm likely going to throw the entire hand away and try again, because the likelihood of me winning that game is a lot lower without these. And subsequently, I may not keep the hand if I don't have my turn 2 follow-up play of either Patchwork Automaton or Walking Ballista with a follow-up Welding Jar to protect the combos. If I don't have these things in my opening hand, I am likely to lose to a deck like, say, Boros Energy. And if I am likely to lose that game, I'm just going to mulligan the hand away and I'll take fewer cards for the likelihood of having the combos I need to win the game. By comparison, in Commander, the optimal turn 1 play for practically everyone at every stage of the game is gonna be a Soul Ring. There are a couple of exceptions here, but generally speaking, this is the optimal play in most of Commander turn 1 if you're not playing in CEDH, right? Well, for almost everyone, this is what you're going for, but how many games of Commander have you felt perfectly comfortable in despite not having this super optimal play every single time? I would argue that so long as your opponent didn't drop a Soul Ring themselves, you probably felt fine. And if your opponent did play a Soul Ring, chances are the other two opponents likely saw that they did and decided to gang up on them like they did on you back when you used to go to high school. And, you know, I'm pretty sure there was some comfort in that, morbid as it may be, but simply having the other players to help you gang up on the Soul Ring player likely helped you feel a lot more comfortable with how the sequencing of that game went. Now, this is obviously not a perfect scenario. The existence of other players does not diminish the power of Soul Ring to that major degree, but it is different than, say, if Soul Ring existed in the Modern format. Now, if we understand this, I want to try to lean into that idea. The idea that two other players are at your Commander table. And in my opinion, they do make all the difference. In a 1 versus 1 game, if you don't make the optimal play every time, but your opponent does, then you fall behind and you lose, generally speaking. In a 4-player pod, the player who's making all the right optimal plays may end up so far ahead before anybody else that they get ganged up on by 3 players, raffle stomped into the dirt during a temporary truce, and now suddenly that far out ahead nature of what they were doing isn't quite as powerful. Now, again, this is not a perfect scenario, nor is it a perfect control mechanism for fast mana and other accelerants, but it does alleviate that feeling of being too slow a bit, especially in comparison to what happens in a 1-versus-1 game of Commander. This is where I want to shift the conversation a bit into dual lands and their purpose in Magic for making sure that you have similarly good sequencing in your games. The purpose of a dual land, well, a dual land in the strictest sense, as in one of the 9 original dual lands, not counting Tropical Island, well, these are the best lands in terms of mana fixing in Magic the Gathering. In terms of mana fixing and speed, there's triomes that technically do better, but they are forced to come to play tapped. So in terms of mana fixing and speed, these are the best ones because they count as both of the land types that they originally are listed as, which means you can get them out of your deck with cards like Nature's Lore or with fetch lands. Because these are searchable with fetch lands and things like Nature's Lore, they are fantastic for guaranteeing that your mana is perfect in turns 1 through 3. But at their price, I really don't think they're providing enough oomph to justify that kind of a price tag, right? It's a dual land, untapped, and it's costing, what, at $400-something for a Bayou, $767 for an Underground Sea? I can buy a whole new video game console for those prices. They're just not worth it at those prices at all. And really, at that point, are they that much different than, say, a Shock Land? Watery Grave is just the same card as Underground Sea, but it's costing me 2 life. It is equally as searchable and equally as fast. Overgrown Tomb is the same as Bayou, except it costs me 2 life. It is equally as searchable and equally as fast. But here's where we have our first degree of power separation for mana fixing. The next most powerful land is a Shock Land, and then by extension, a Fetch Land. But you'll notice that the price of Fetch Lands is still obscenely high, right? Like $20 for a Verdant Catacombs is quite a bit. But the trade-off is that fetches can grab us whatever lands we need from our deck, and they enhance the power of already powerful decks. A deck that has Shock Lands, or heaven forbid, it's got true dual lands in it, is very, very capable of getting its mana sequencing whenever it wants. But once you add fetch lands, those fetch lands give you access to everything, period. In, say, a 3-color deck, this land can be one of 3 dual lands that you have available, one of 3 Shock Lands you have available, one of 3 of the new Surveil lands you have available, and of course, your Triome that is available in those colors. But you'll notice a price with every single thing that I've shown you. These are all $15 to $20, with there being some exceptions that get around the $10 range, but they are fewer and farther between compared to everything else. And if Wizards of the Coast decides to give us any more typed lands, that power is only going to multiply and compound. But when we look at this Undersea Sewers, we see something. This is a land that comes into play tapped, and that tapping comes in exchange for it being both searchable and being able to scry a card from our deck. Well, surveil a card from our deck, but there's not much of a difference between those two things unless we are playing specifically a graveyard deck. But here's where we hit our first snag. This $20 land is, well, a tapped land. A tapped land. Now, that's a concept. Even within the overwhelming power of the searchable dual lands, a tapped land is considered passable as long as it is searchable. This means that a lot of players end up leaning on lands that, yes, come into play tapped, while also repeating the words from content creators saying that no lands in their deck should enter tapped if they can help it. And while I understand that concept, and I used to agree with that concept, there are a couple types of lands that I find very, very enticing that a lot of content creators seem to not be able to stand. One of them are the tapped dual lands from Dominaria. This is Tangled Islet, and realistically, is there that much difference between this and a $20 breeding pool? Obviously, the breeding pool costs literally 100 times as much, but are you getting 100 times the power out of the breeding pool than you do with the Tangled Islet? I would say no. And in terms of the Surveil land, that's sitting at about $15. And are we really getting that much more power out of this than we would out of a 10-cent Temple of Mystery? They both come down the same way. They both come into play tapped. The only difference is one is searchable and the other is not. One has Surveil and the other does not. That does give 2 degrees of power more, but at the end of the day, if my deck contains both a Temple of Mystery and a Tangled Islet, if I'm casting a Nature's Lore, I'm going to be able to grab any of these, and it's not going to change anything for me. If my Wood Elves comes onto the battlefield and it grabs a Tangled Islet, am I really going to be that much more upset than that I don't have a Hedge Maze in that slot? No, not really. The Wood Elves is grabbing the same damn thing either way, and it's going to end up having the same effect on my gameplay either way. So I want to explore this idea real quick. The idea that a land must have some type of very good beneficial ability in order to justify coming into play tapped. A lot of content creators that I've watched have made the argument that a land coming into play tapped means that it has to spend 1 mana worth of resources because it's coming into play tapped, so the land is effectively costing you 1 mana. So what is 1 mana worth in Magic the Gathering? Well, I would argue that paying 1 mana is well worth preventing a reanimation player from being able to play the game for a significant amount of time. So cards like Bojuka Bog automatically make the cut for me because they are doing 1 mana's worth of ability and still giving me colored mana afterwards. I'm not going resource negative when I play this. And I think that's the other thing to note with lands. Lands don't make you go resource negative when you play them. You still go resource positive. Or at the very least, resource neutral. I'm sorry, not resource positive. You go resource neutral. The other way you go resource neutral is with cantrips like Opt or Consider, but here's where we hit a snag. Opt and Consider are effectively doing the same kind of thing, giving you the same amount of resources as the previously mentioned cards like Hedge Maze and Temple of Mystery. Now, originally, I was under the impression that no, this is not the same thing because Opt draws you a card, Consider draws you a card, but in terms of the actual resources that you end up with, the Temple of Mystery and the Hedge Maze give you the same amount of cards as the Opt and Consider do, with one exception. The Surveil is stronger because reanimation decks can utilize a card in graveyard much, much better. Aside from that, we still end up with the same number of cards available to us, and we still end up with the same effects either way. So these 2 cards aren't that far in gulf in power from 1 mana contemporaries, so these are still worth 1 mana worth of an ability. I used to believe that these didn't justify the cost of coming into play tapped because, well, I picked up that idea from other content creators, and I guess I really didn't think for myself very much, but also the way it was articulated to me was that these were effectively coming down with half a mana of an ability because they didn't have the draw as well, but I wasn't taking into consideration the fact that I'm not going card negative when I play these. As I've grown as a content creator, as a player, and most importantly, I think, as I've had experiences using the Surveil lands to sculpt the first few turns of my games, I think my tune on these kinds of lands has really, really changed. Cards like Consider are, in fact, 1 mana worth of ability. They are Surveil and Draw. The math is easy, but looking at the actual cardboard and the economy of those cards, I end up with the same resources either way, so they're not really that far different from one another. And if a temple is going to cost me 20 cents, but an underground sewer is going to cost me $20, is that underground sewer quite literally 100 times more powerful than the other land? And I would argue no, not really. And you don't need the latter unless you are running an incredibly powerful deck. To explain this idea real quick, I want to go ahead and propose an idea to you, the dollars to power conversion principle. So to explain that concept real quick, a dollars to power conversion to me is the amount of power a card yields to your deck versus the need for the power of that card in your local meta versus the dollars it takes to acquire that card and put it in your deck. So If a card yields only a little bit of strength compared to other cards like a Shock Land, and everyone at your LGS is using Shock Lands that you want to keep up with, but the dollars invested into that Shock Land don't do the same as, say, $15 worth of other two-color lands, then they aren't really worth the price of admission, and you can do this conversion for any card, really. Take Wristic Study. This is one of the best-in-class draw cards in Commander Magic the Gathering. But look at that price tag, $54. What if, for a tenth of the price, you played a Mystic Remora? The dollars to power conversion here says, oh, this will help me keep up almost as much as the Wristic Study will. It comes down a couple turns earlier even, and its ability is almost as powerful. Even in a world where people around me are running Wristic Study, then you still can utilize this card pretty dang well. But there is another thing to take into consideration. Wristic Study's on the Game Changers list, so just in this specific example, you may not have to worry about that because everybody has access to that list and knows that this card is kind of a faux pas at lower power tables. But for the dollars to power conversion, if you're looking at Wristic Study and you're wanting to put this in your deck, or even the Mystic Remora, do you really gain more power out of one of these versus having an entire draw suite in your deck for a similar or even less price? For $1.50, an Archmage Emeritus will give you lots of draw. Combat decks get access to Reconnaissance Mission and Coastal Piracy and Military Intelligence and Bident of Thassa, and that's just the budget options here. If you want consistent draw over the course of a game, Kumena's Awakening is a Phyrexian arena available for blue players, and if you want card selection, Memory Deluge, Dawn from Dreams, and Dig Through Time all allow you to take the best cards from the top chunk of your deck for a very reasonable mana cost. All of these can be had for the low price of a handful of pennies, and you can make your deck work with them just as well. You didn't need the Wristic Study, and the reason you didn't need the Wristic Study isn't because it's bad, but it's because we go back to that conversion. The power of the card may be high, but the need of the card is not really that high. It's more of a neutral need unless you're in CEDH, and the price of the card is so high that it overpowers whatever power the card might be. A brand new video game or a Wristic Study, which do you think you're going to enjoy more? They cost the same. And, you know, obviously there is an argument here for Proxying Cards, but again, I've mentioned before, my channel is not made for people who are trying to proxy their cards. You do budget decks because you want to work well within a limited set of resources. If you are proxying cards, you have removed the limiter on those resources. If you want to proxy your cards, go right ahead. This video is not for you. I thank you for the engagement in the comment section regardless. But this does naturally lead us to a different statement entirely. If we're looking at cards based on the amount of dollars that go into them versus the relative power that comes out of them, I want to take a look back at this Watery Grave. If we have, say, $15, and we have a choice to put Watery Grave in our deck for those $15, is there a way we could make that $15 stretch way further? This naturally makes me want to back up the statements like $15 worth of lands. So across $15 worth of lands, let's find a deck that we can put some lands in and provide a similar consistency to what a Shock Land would yield to that deck. And let's go ahead and make it a 3-colored deck. That way we have the kind of deck that most desires mana fixing, and see what we come up with. We won't be using 2-color decks because they can get away with more basic lands and fewer dual lands in general because they are way more forgiving with what mana pips they require. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we can cook up. If our deck includes green, then our job gets even easier, but if it doesn't include green, we're going to make a land base for that as well. But for our deck's template, let's say that the majority of our lands cannot be basic, and a majority of our lands must enter untapped. If a land enters tapped, then we want to make sure that that land justifies coming into play tapped. See the previous Scrying and Bajuka Bogging examples from before. And of our tapped lands, we don't want to have so many that they mess up our early game plays, so we want to make sure that we are focusing our math on early game plays so that we are not slower than our opponents. So in order to achieve this, we're going to use a tool called a Hypergeometric Calculator. If you're not familiar with that, let me go ahead and show you what it do. So a hypergeometric calculator for Magic the Gathering can be used to determine the likelihood of seeing a particular card in an opening hand. In order to achieve the math that we're looking for, I'm going to see about drawing a sample hand. If 30 of our mana sources in the deck are untapped, what are the chances that we see at least 2 of those sources in an opening hand from a deck of 99? We can see here that we have almost a 70% chance that we will see at least 2 sources of mana with the ability to come into play untapped. Those are very, very good odds. Now, if we change this sample size to 1, to account for the amount of tapped lands that will be in the deck, and change the sources in our population to 10, now suddenly we see that we have a 53% chance to see 1 tapped land in an opening hand. The chance of seeing 1 of these is a little above 50%. I would say that's pretty much acceptable. In half your games, you may play a tapped land, but in 2/3 of your games, you will have really good mana sequencing to back up those tapped lands. And if you play a tapped land on turn 1, it really doesn't change things for you in any perceivable way. It doesn't hurt you at all. With a little more math, we can see that if our deck contains 40 lands total, and we want to see 3 lands in our opening hand, we will see that almost a third of the time, with 59.4% chance to draw what we need, which is honestly pretty great. But if we change that sample size to 10.5, basically giving us a hand and a half to factor in our first mulligan, then the chances of seeing a playable hand bump up to 85.3%. By factoring in that first free mulligan, the chances increase a lot. This is using the same logic that you would use for successful coin flips landing on heads. The chance of any one coin landing on heads is always 50-50, but the chance of multiple coins landing on heads gets lower and lower with every subsequent flip, because the chance is not just what is the chance of the current flip, it is the chance of what is the chance of 3 flips that are all heads. The same logic applies here. Now that we've established our parameters, how can we use these odds in our favor? Well, one way is obviously using more lands. Rebel made a wonderful video suggesting 43 lands, and if we use these same calculations, after a mulligan, we get almost 90% chance to have a perfectly keepable hand with Rebel's numbers. That's really, really good and incredibly helpful. But since this is Commander and we can afford a bit of a tempo loss in order to stuff some fun cards into the deck, I'm comfortable with 40 lands. And that's still more lands than most people generally play anyway. So yeah, we're gonna go with that for now. And okay, no more math. Let's see what we can come up with. So for our deck that contains green with a $1.86, well, $1.86 when I wrote this script, the price has fluctuated and now it's $1.71. So for $1.71, we actually have a very good selection of tapped lands. Now that we're not doing math anymore, we can get back to doing math with money. We will be using a couple fetching lands, Evolving Wilds and Foreboding Landscape, though there are more fetching lands you can use in here if you want, and I'll get into when we use those a little later. Fetching lands grant us every land in our deck, and of course, we want to have fetchable lands for cards like Farseek and Nature's Lore. Farseek can yank any non-forest out of the deck effectively, and Nature's Lore and cards like it can yank any forest out of the deck. And if those cards are too rich for your blood, which I can understand, I would like to direct you to cards like Wood Elves that just happen to be 20 cents. Back to the deck. In order to yank these out of the deck, we are going to be having to put in a Tangled Islet and a Haunted Mire, because these cards, despite costing 15 cents, do actually meet the requirements of being searchable. So our deck does not lose any tempo simply because we decided not to put in a $15 land. After that, I've already made my arguments that temples are not as bad as we usually argue that they are. So the Temple of Mystery, Malady, and the Temple of Deceit can all make their way here. And then if we want to make sure that we always have our lands at all times, then an Opulent Palace does not hurt, especially for 15 cents. I used to be much more agitated at this card. I really did not like using it, but the more that I play, the more I realize if we get this in our opening hand, we can just drop it down and it never hurts us ever again. And we can even combine the scry from the temples by adding in a Path of Ancestry, but the path is going to scry for us when we cast our commander, and you can use this in practically any deck at all because your commander is always going to share a card type with your commander. And in this version of the deck, we've even managed to shove in at least one utility land with the Bojuka Bog. And I've made mention of these before, but of our fetching lands, the Budget All-Star Evolving Wilds is always going to play second fiddle to something like Foreboding Landscape. These landscapes definitely need to be in every 3-color deck you are building, especially decks that are built on a budget. These things are fantastic. They come into play untapped. They can grab your colors when you need them. They can cycle out of your hand when you get mana clumped. These are fantastic. But that does lead us to the secondary question. If we've got $12 more, what do we do with that? Obviously, 32 of our cents get to go to the obvious includes of Command Tower and Exotic Orchard. But when we get to our Simic Lands, $2.50 are comprised of 7 lands total. Vine Glimmer, Snarl, I actually do like these lands a lot more than people seem to make them out to be. Like, these lands do provide a lot of utility being dual lands, and they come into play untapped most of the time. It's okay. We get to fill out every land slot by using these. Then we get the Odyssey filters, like Overflowing Basin. Again, people seem to not like these things, and I don't understand why. Lands like this are fantastic. They don't come down on turn 1, and that's perfectly okay. You have over 30 other lands that can come into play on turn 1, and people seem to really prefer the other filters from Llanowar, or not Llanowar, what am I saying? Lorwyn. But those filters, as good as they are, do have a glaring problem for me, and that is that they do not work off of colorless mana. I'm a guy that likes my utility lands, and a lot of utility lands only tap for colorless mana. Flooded Grove doesn't help here, but in this deck, it's a 20-cent dual land. We can run it. For 24 cents, we get Yavimaya Coast. For 30 cents, we get Hinterland Harbor. For 44 cents, we get Waterlogged Grove. And for $1, we get Dreamroot Cascade. Yavimaya Coast is a pain land. Nobody would ever argue these are bad. Hinterland Harbor is a check land. It comes down at about the same rate as Vine Glimmer Snarl. It just depends on how you're sequencing your cards. And Waterlogged Grove is a fantastic card because late in the game, if you get mana flooded, it just replaces itself by being sacrificed to draw a card. And slow lands, I'm so happy these are getting reprinted in precons. These things are fantastic. When we move over to our Golgari lands, we only have access to 6 at our budget, but they make up only $2 of what we have in the deck. Viridescent Bog is doing work here, the same as the Overflowing Basin. The Necroblossom Snarl is doing the same job as the Snarl in the other colors. The Woodland Cemetery is the same as the other check land. Llanowar East is the same as our other pain land. And Twilight Mire is the same as our other Lorwyn dual land, the Lorwyn filter land. It's the same thing, just in different colors. But because we're in black, we get access to Tainted Wood, which lets us get 2 different colors so long as we have a swamp down. And this is the reason why I still advocate for running things like Evolving Wilds and Foreboding Landscape, as these cards do have the ability to yank a swamp out of our deck, and because cards like Haunted Mire are searchable, we can still get another swamp out of the deck with cards like Nature's Lore, and it just ends up working out really well for us. But where things get interesting is when we talk about allied colors instead of enemy colors. When we talk about allied colors, we get access to some more interesting cards. Like, obviously, we have black in here, so Tainted Isle gets to be one of our Dimir lands. And yeah, the Dimir lands cost $7. Not because they really do, but because almost all of that money is being kept up by this Shipwreck Marsh, because I wanted to add a little bit of extra oomph to the mana base, and I decided this was better than a basic land. But the slow land for Dimir costs a little bit more. But you still get your Pain Land with Underground River. You still get your Check Land with Drowned Catacombs. You still get your Reveal Land in Choked Estuary, and you still get your Odyssey filter in Dark Water Catacombs. But the two cards that are interesting for me are River of Tears, which is a fantastic land that people don't like because they don't like sequencing their mana. They don't like thinking about their lands, and that's half the problem. River of Tears is a fantastic inclusion in any deck with Dimir, as it gives you both of your deck's colors most of the time. It's always going to be blue mana, and if you play a land, it's going to give you black mana. Just sequence your lands correctly, and this card will never steer you wrong. And for 11 cents, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for you. And because we're in an ally color, you get access to cards like Sunken Hollow, a Tango land that enters the battlefield untapped as long as we have our other basic lands. And Sunken Hollow is searchable out of the deck with a Farseek, just like our other dual lands are, except it comes into play untapped if we get it out with something that can yank a land and put it into the battlefield untapped, unlike a card like Farseek. For Farseek, this is doing the same thing, but if we draw it later in the game, this is now an untapped land that doesn't mess up our sequencing at all. For $12, we managed to fill in every single mana slot. We only used 7 basic lands, and we're leaning on 3 forests, because this list, without a deck to complement it, is assuming that most of our ramp is green, and thus we need earlier access to green mana than our other basic lands. However, what happens when we do this same exact experiment with a different set of parameters, a different color combination? Well, let's go ahead and see what happens when we try to build a Mardu deck by comparison. Same template, we're going to be using 10 tapped lands, and we still are going to be using the Evolving Wilds here, and we're going to be using... Oh, wow, you can't see those. Sorry. We're still going to be using the Evolving Wilds here. We're still going to be using the Shattered Landscape here. They're performing the identical duties as in the other deck. The temples are still here, performing their duties just as well. The Path of Ancestry, the Tri-Land, the Bajuka Bog, and we still have 2 searchable lands. Now, why do we have these in here when the deck doesn't contain green? Surely an advantage of green is the ability to grab typed lands out of the deck, and that is unique to green. Well, not really. You see, cards like Knight of the White Orchid cost 2 mana, just like Nature's Lore, and they grab a Plains out of the deck, and they can grab a dual land out of the deck just as easily as anything else. Core Cartographer does the same job as a Wood Elves. It grabs a Plains out of the deck, and it doesn't care about grabbing a basic Plains. Charitable Levy stacks your opponents out of the first couple turns, and it too yanks a Plains out of your deck while also replacing itself. And for 7 cents, that is a lot of heavy lifting for a card to do. And just like before, our tapped lands only really costed us about $1.77. For the rest of our budget, we are only going to be running 8 basic lands, only 1 more than in the previous example. But that's because we're going to be utilizing the Power Crept Panoramas in order to make up for our lack of fixing that green normally gives us. Promising Vein and Shire Terrace are able to play at the same speed as normal lands like Command Tower and Exotic Orchard, but in a pinch they can sacrifice themselves to grab the cards we need, like an Evolving Wilds, with a bit of an extra cost. These cards will also allow us to curb the need to chug our deck filled with more swamps, because we are going to be running tainted lands in here as we have access to black, so we may as well utilize the budget options that we are given here. But this list is going to look very similar to what we saw before. A tainted land, a Snarl land, a check land, a pain land, a true filter from Lorwyn, an Odyssey filter. These are still in here. The lists look very much the same. When we go to Boros, we have our Reveal land, we have our check land, we have our Odyssey filter, we have our Lorwyn filter, we have a Horizon Canopy style land just because I was at $10 and wanted to put a more expensive land in, just like with the other ones, because I said $15 before I started putting the lists together. We still get a pain land. you still get access to all of these at this price point. And when we go to the allied colors, we once again find we get access to some new stuff. The allied color here is Rakdos. We get Tainted Peak. We get the Foreboding Ruins for our reveal land. We get Shadowblood Ridge as our Odyssey filter. We get Dragonskull Summit as our check land and Sulphurous Springs as our pain land. But we also gain access to Smoldering Marsh, which just so happens to be a swamp, so it works in tandem with our Tainted Lands. But it's a come into play untapped land, not unlike a shock land. Jesus, the amount of power we can get out of this deck, there's not a deck, but this land base, which I would say is a complete land base. You could upgrade it further, but at that point you're doubling, tripling, quadrupling the price of the land base. $13.94. And if we flip over to my lands guide, you'll see that there's even more options we have if we're willing to pay just a little bit more. If we are looking at, say, Boros, for $3, we get access to a Needleverge Pathway. For $4, we get access to a Sundown Pass. In the Dimir Lands, after the Shipwreck Marsh, there's Clearwater Pathway for $4. Sunken Ruins is getting a reprint, dropping it from $20-something to $4 as well. If Golgari's more your speed, $5 gets you the flip land from Golgari, and another $5.50 will give you the Verge land from Aetherdrift in Golgari's colors. And the list goes on and on. Every single land outside of True Duels that are worth running in Commander, I have listed on my lands guide for you to check out if you want to see how you can build land bases for cheaper and find the stuff that is in your colors that you need. But this does beg a question: how the hell did we even get here? Well, we got here thanks to reprints. Lands which used to be some of the most cost-prohibitive parts of the game have now been completely replaced with budget options that are the same thing, just they're from a different set. Look at Sunken Ruins, $4.49. Far more than any land that I chose to put into my list, but still a very expensive land. It just got printed in a pre-con. But if we flip to the original printings of it, well, not the original printing, but the more recent printings of it, we look at the one from Double Masters, which is running us $21, not unlike the cards I previously derided, like Undercity Sewers. It's costing about that much. And is it really giving us $20 worth of power compared to other similar colors that have the exact same card, but in different color combinations, for like 30 cents? You can construct these very immaculate and good mana bases filled to the brim with some of the best lands available in the game right now for $15. For the price of a single watery grave. In terms of dollars to power, which of these mana bases make our decks run smoother? An entire $15 mana base filled to the brim with everything we need, or a single shock land? And I know you can add a shock land to that mana base and make it better, but again, at that point, you have quite literally doubled the price of your mana base. And I know you could just proxy everything, but again, not the point of these discussions. But thank you for the interaction anyway. You guys are wonderful. I appreciate all of you. I did some digging, and check this out. Look at all these lands and their prices. We're not looking at hypothetical prices from Moxfield that may or may not be accurate. No, Fetid Pools, $12. That's a bicycle land. That's great. Game Trail, that's a reveal land. It's fantastic. Mossword Valley, Odyssey Filter, River of Tears. I'm never going to stop singing the praises of that thing. Sheltered Thicket, Scattered Grove, Skycloud Expanse, Temple of Abandon. All of these are lands that justify their existence in your deck, and they all costed me 10 cents each. I bought multiples of them. I spent $5 on these things. Look at these prices, though. For $12.98, I got 6 Snarl lands, I got 7 Tango lands, 7 Check lands, another 2 Check lands, 7 Sunscorched Divides, the new Odyssey filter prints from Fallout. I got 5 Tainted lands and 7 more Check lands, and all of this this is because of Universes Beyond, Commander Masters. All of these are reprint sets. The Viridescent Bogs are getting reprinted. The Temples get reprinted all the time. The Tango Lands get reprinted, and so they are costing pennies on the dollar. And these lands are just, they are fantastic for deck building with. The only reason that you aren't is because either you didn't know about them or somebody told you they were not worth your time. And that somebody did not have the health of your wallet in mind when they said that. The power of the Shock Land, or heaven forbid, a true dual land, is undeniable. But I think people get way too hung up on needing the best, most perfect mana base for their casual game of cardboard war. Don't let the want for a perfect mana base get in the way of a very, very perfectly good enough mana base that you could get in reality for pennies on the dollar. Building using mana bases like these will help you to make more decks and enjoy Commander far more as a format, as your decks play out infinitely more smoothly than they would with either a ton of basic lands or a bunch of bad tapped lands if you have to be on a budget. We enjoy the game more when we make lots of things that we like, and we only focus the extra dollars on the decks that truly stand out and we truly enjoy investing the extra time and money into. Lord knows, I have my decks that I'm willing to get the pretty artworks for and get the most expensive cards for as I get the opportunity. But that's not how I build my decks to begin with. I don't look for the most expensive things to build the best mana bases initially. I build the mana base that gets the deck off the ground and running very, very well. And for $15, you can do that too. I've given you all the resources you need. My lands guide will be linked in the description below. And you can always rewind this video to see how I built those mana bases and sculpt them and cater them to the mana distribution for what you need in your deck. If your deck leans more green, cut some of the Dimir lands out of that deck package. You can do that. I've got other videos on how to sculpt your mana bases. But this was not about that. This was about putting a mana base together that does the job and does the job incredibly well for pennies on the dollar, so that you don't have to go looking for the most expensive lands to get your deck off the ground. I guarantee you most of these lands that do a fantastic job for your deck are going to be in a bulk binder at your local game store. I personally bought 450 of these lands. 5 to 6 of every color combination, 7 of each of these. Why did I do it? Surely that was a fool's errand for somebody who's already got a bunch of decks, but no, not really. Not for me. I get to have these things as lands that I get to use whenever I want to build anything that I want. And if I have a friend who needs a couple lands to finish out a deck, I'll have those ready for them too now. And ultimately, even if I hand them a complete mana package, I'll have only spent $1 or $2 towards it, and they would have gotten a fully functional deck. And I think that's perfectly fine. Let's build more stuff cheaper so that we can enjoy this game more and in a more healthy way. That's my thought anyway. That said, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, Patreon, all that other fun stuff. Insert end video tagline here. Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravelern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Mark Anthony, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fire Shard. and everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full time, and with your help, I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.